In lesson one of chapter 8, labor mobility, we're going to look at migration. We have native workers, we have the native worker labor market on the left, and we have the undocumented worker labor market on the right. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act made it illegal for employers in the United States to knowingly hire undocumented workers. The legislation did not reduce the flow of undocumented workers into the country. The following equations represent the native worker labor market and the undocumented worker labor market. Compute the equilibrium number of employees in each market and the respective market clearing wage rates using these assumed hypothetical labor demand and labor supply curves. So we're going to do the native worker, the hypothetical native worker labor demand first. So there's the labor demand curve and the labor supply curve. We're going to make them both black lines. And then I got to fix the x-axis. So I'm going to click on the wrench here. And notice that 250 is the maximum x value here. So I'm going to change that right here to 250, or I'll change it to what, 200? 200 is good. Okay. And they'll do the same for the undocumented worker labor demand, labor supply curves. But I'll make a new graph. Okay, so again, I got to change the x-axis to about 200, right? So, and then I'm going to change the colors to both black to match the mob math. Okay, the equilibrium native worker wage and level of employment is just found by clicking on the intersection of demand and supply of those two equations, right? The graphs of those two equations. And so we have an employment level of 100, which makes sense, right? Because they cross right at 100 here. And then a market wage of 1167. Okay, now for the undocumented workers, we have a market wage of 739. And we have an employment level of 86. And these are in thousands. Okay. The intercept of the native labor demand implies that firms are willing to pay what? So firms are willing to pay up to 1667 for that first native worker hired. The intercept of the native labor supply implies a native worker, at least one, has a reservation wage that is as low as 667. So the native worker with the lowest reservation wage is just about 667, right? Now the last worker hired in the native labor market, the 100th that is hired, that worker has a reservation wage equal to the market wage, right? So the market wage is 1167. That last worker hired, that 100th native worker hired, is the marginal worker, right? The firms are willing to pay that last native worker hired, right? They're willing to pay up to the demand curve for that 100th worker, which is 1167. So the marginal firm and the marginal worker, they set the wage rate, right? The intercept of the undocumented labor demand implies that firms are willing to pay up to what? So here is labor demand and labor supply of the undocumented workers. And they're willing to pay up to 1169 for the first of them hired. There is one undocumented worker that is willing to work for at least $3.09. The reservation wage of the last undocumented worker hired, the 86th one, is the market wage of $7.39, right? And the firms are willing to pay up to $7.39 for that last undocumented worker hired, right? Okay, suppose undocumented workers and native workers are perfect complements, right? Three isoquants are shown below the diagram. There are more than just these three, right? But these three correspond to quantities of 310 units of output, 465 units of firm output, and 589 units of firm output, right? And there's, infinite many more that we could draw, but we were only drawing three of them, right? The slope of the isocost line that passes through the cost minimizing number of undocumented native workers is the ratio of the market wages, right? So we have undocumented workers here, right? So the undocumented market wage is $7.39, right? Since undocumented workers are on the x-axis, the slope of an isocost line is their wage divided by the wage of native-born workers. And the wage of native-born workers is $11.67, right? So the isocost line is going to have a slope of 0.63. So the slope would be 0.63, right? And you can see the line, the isocost line here, the green one, right? This green line has a slope of 0.63. And this isocost line, and there's thousands, millions of isocost lines. They're all parallel to this one because of this wage ratio, right? Every isocost line is going to have that shape or that slope, right? So the cost minimizing number of undocumented workers would be 86, right? And that is 100. And those are the outcomes up here, right? 86 undocumented workers, 100 native-born workers. And together, those two groups of people are producing for firms 465 units of output, right? At this point, the market price of the product supplied by these firms equals 389, right? So 389 is the price of each one of these units, right? Okay, so to get the total cost of labor, we multiply the 86 by the wage rate, and we're going to add the 100 native workers times their wage, 11.67, right? So this is the number of undocumented workers working at $7.39 an hour, and this is the number of native-born workers making $11.67 an hour for a total cost of $1,800, right? Roughly $1,800. Firm revenue would be what then? $289 or $389 per unit, and 465 units are being produced. So total revenue is just above our total cost, and our total revenue minus our total cost is $6.31 per hour, right? To stem the flow of immigration or migration, steep penalties on employers who break immigration law were proposed under this law here, right? If a substantial increase in penalties for hiring undocumented workers reduced the number of undocumented workers by 43,000, right? So the way I got this here is I took the 86,000 and I subtracted off the 43,000 and I got 43,000, right? So the number of workers in the undocumented labor market would reduce to 43,000, right? This would result in an undocumented worker market wage of what? So firms are reducing their hiring of undocumented workers by 43,000, right? So we come up here and we see labor demand fall, right? We see labor demand fall from the black curve to the purple curve, right? And this is that demand curve, right? 7.39 minus 0.05 E. We're going to copy that and we're going to put it up here. Right? So the new market wage is only 524. And the employment level is 43, right? The result of the enhanced penalties will change the native employment level to what? Well, since the two are perfect complements, right? We were at 86, now we're at 43, right? So what will happen is firms will only be able to produce 310 units because undocumented workers and native workers are perfect substitutes, right? Perfect complements, right? So the new output will be 310. We'll hire 43 undocumented workers, 43,000 and 57,000 native workers, right? So the result of the enhanced penalties will change the employment level of native workers to 57,000. This result in native worker market wage of what? So see the native worker market demand for their labor decreases to this red line, right? And the red equation is right here. So we're going to put that equation over here, right? We're going to change that to red. So the new labor demand produces a market wage of 952 and 57 native born workers hired, right? 57,000. So the new market wage is 952. Okay. The enhanced penalties result in a new cost minimizing number of undocumented workers and native workers. It'll be at this point here, right? The slope of the ISO cost line that passes through the new cost minimizing numbers of these workers is a ratio of the new market wage rates, right? So I'm gonna come back over here. I'm gonna delete these here. I'm gonna change this to the new market wage for undocumented immigrants, 524. I'm going to change this down here to the new market wage for undocumented workers. Native born workers to 9.52. The new slope is 0.55. The ISO cost line shifted from this light green line to this dark green line, and the optimal solution went from this black dot to that black dot, right? The new cost minimizing number of undocumented workers is equal to 43,000, and the number of native born workers is equal to 57,000. If the market price of the product supplied, we're holding it constant, 389, right? Maybe American firms are competing with foreign firms, and this is the world price. The new revenue is the new quantity here, 310 times the price being held constant. So the new revenue is $1,205.90. So we're going to put that down here, right there. We have to calculate the new cost. Only 43 undocumented workers are hired. They're hired at this lower wage of 524. 57 native born workers are hired at a lower wage of 952. And the cost is 767.96, right? That's the new total cost. Total cost of employment. The economic profits, we're going to subtract that value from the economic revenue, right? And so we get an economic profit of $437.94. The restricted policy results in blank thousand native workers and blank thousand undocumented workers losing their jobs. So we had 86 minus 43,000 undocumented workers lose their jobs, right? And then we had 100 native workers minus 57 lose their job. So 100 native workers minus 57 lose their jobs, which is 43. So both these are 43,000, right? Both labor markets shut in place because of this policy. If the undocumented workers who lose their jobs have no family in this country and have no means to return to their homes, many of them will end up homeless in America. In addition, the wage rates of native and undocumented workers who retain their jobs declined by how many dollars each? So the original wage for the undocumented worker was $7.39. The new wage of the undocumented worker is $5.24, right? So the undocumented worker's wage fell $2.15. What about the wages of native-born workers? The native-born worker wage was $11.67. The new native-born worker wage is $9.52. So the wage rate of the native-born workers and the wage rate of the undocumented workers, in my model, both fell by $2.15 each. So the workers who are lucky enough to keep their jobs as a result of the crackdown on undocumented workers, they both saw massive pay cuts, right? We also saw a massive layoff of native-born workers. So unemployment is also higher, right? Native-born workers, 100,000 of them working before the restrictions on undocumented workers was in place. 57,000 are now working, so 43,000 native-born workers lost their jobs. The same number of undocumented workers lost their jobs. And a lot of them, if they didn't have family, they don't have much money, they can't get back to their home country, so maybe a lot of them end up on the street. And maybe that's an explanation of why we have so many homeless people in California.